December 18, 1944. The snow-covered forests of the Ardennes region lay silent under a frozen moon, the temperature hovering near -15 degrees. Along a defensive position stretching 3 kilometers through dense woodland, soldiers from the American Armed Forces huddled in hastily dug foxholes, their breath forming clouds in the bitter air. Among them stood Private James Harrison, a 23-year-old from Detroit, Michigan, whose hands gripped what his fellow soldiers had nicknamed the grease gun, a weapon so unglamorous in appearance that enemy forces had repeatedly dismissed it as little more than a crude pipe with a trigger. What none of them knew as the night settled around them with deceptive calm was that this unassuming tool would soon rewrite the rules of close-quarters engagement in the most dramatic fashion imaginable. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. Over the next 8 hours, the assumptions of trained soldiers, the certainty of military doctrine, and the prejudices of an entire era would collide with a reality so stark, so undeniable, that survivors would carry the memory of this night for the rest of their lives. The transformation that would unfold was not merely tactical, but deeply human, as mockery gave way to respect and a weapon dismissed as worthless proved itself through the most fundamental measure of all: survival. Private James Harrison had arrived at the front 3 weeks earlier, part of a replacement battalion, sent to reinforce positions after heavy losses during the autumn campaigns. Standing 6 feet tall with broad shoulders built from years working in the automobile factories of Detroit, Harrison carried himself with quiet dignity despite the constant challenges he faced. As one of the few African-American soldiers serving in a combat role during this period, he had learned to let his actions speak louder than words, a lesson that would prove prophetic in the hours ahead. The weapon he carried, officially designated the M3 submachine gun, but universally called the grease gun due to its resemblance to a mechanic's tool, had been issued to him just days before. Manufactured by the Guide Lamp division of General Motors, the same company where Harrison had worked before enlisting, the weapon represented American industrial philosophy at its most pragmatic. Weighing 7.5 pounds unloaded, constructed primarily from stamped metal parts, it cost just $20 to produce compared to the $200 price tag of its predecessor. With a cyclic rate of 450 rounds per minute, significantly slower than most contemporary weapons, and chambered in .45 caliber ammunition, the grease gun embodied simplicity over elegance, function over form. Sergeant William McCreary, a veteran of the North African campaign who had served with distinction in Tunisia, had watched Harrison clean and inspect his weapon that morning with the methodical care of a skilled craftsman. McCreary, a 31-year-old from rural Pennsylvania, had seen enough combat to recognize competence when he observed it, regardless of the prejudices that still infected military culture. The sergeant had served in integrated units in the Mediterranean theater, where he had witnessed firsthand that courage, skill, and dedication transcended the artificial boundaries of race that civilian society insisted on maintaining. Harrison said to him, while carefully checking the weapon's bolt mechanism, "I know what some of the men think about this thing. They see it and laugh because it looks like something you would use to grease car axles, not fight a war. Back in Detroit, I worked the assembly line where they made parts for weapons just like this. I understand what it is and what it is not. It is not fancy, it is not expensive, but it is reliable." McCreary responded, his weathered face thoughtful. "I have seen fancy weapons jam when you need them most. I have seen expensive equipment fail in the mud and cold. In Tunisia, we captured some of the enemy's finest weapons, beautifully made, precision engineered. Half of them stopped working after a week in the desert. What matters is not how something looks, but whether it works when everything goes wrong. A weapon is just a tool, and a tool is only as good as the person using it." What neither man could have known was how prophetic those words would prove. The German armed forces of that era, equipped with weapons renowned for their precision engineering and superior craftsmanship, had developed a certain contempt for American military equipment. Their standard infantry weapons, the Karabiner 98 Kurz rifle and the MP-40 submachine gun, represented years of refined development and traditional manufacturing excellence. These weapons were products of a culture that valued craftsmanship, precision, and adherence to traditional manufacturing methods. The contrast between these weapons and the crudely stamped American grease gun seemed to confirm their assumptions about industrial mass production versus artisanal quality. Lieutenant Friedrich Weber, a 27-year-old officer from Munich, who commanded a reconnaissance unit positioned in the forest across from the American lines, had spent the afternoon studying the enemy positions through his binoculars. A veteran of campaigns in Russia and France, Weber prided himself on his tactical acumen and his ability to assess enemy capabilities. He came from a family with military traditions spanning generations, and his education had emphasized the superiority of systematic training and quality equipment. When he spotted Harrison moving between positions, the distinctive profile of the grease gun clearly visible, Weber had actually laughed aloud. He remarked to his subordinate, Corporal Hans Richter, "Look at what the Americans arm their soldiers with now. It appears they have given that man a plumber's tool and sent him to fight. Their factories must be producing toys while they claim to be the arsenal of democracy. I have seen better craftsmanship in the hands of apprentices. How can they expect to prevail with such crude implements?" Richter, a 19-year-old from Hamburg serving his first winter campaign, had joined in the mockery, though something in the way Harrison handled the weapon gave him pause. The American's movements were precise, professional, his attention to detail evident even at a distance. The way he checked the magazine, inspected the bolt, maintained his equipment, spoke of someone who understood his tools intimately. But such observations were easy to dismiss when confidence ran high and assumptions went unchallenged. Richter had been raised in a culture that emphasized the superiority of German engineering and manufacturing, taught from childhood that quality and precision were uniquely valued in his homeland. The German unit Weber commanded consisted of 47 soldiers, a reinforced platoon equipped with standard infantry weapons, 2 light machine guns, and ample ammunition. Their mission was to probe the American defenses, identify weak points, and if possible create chaos in the rear areas through a night infiltration. The plan called for a silent approach through the dense forest, using the terrain and darkness to close within striking distance before the Americans could mount an effective response. Weber had executed similar operations a dozen times before, in Russia, in France, always with success. He saw no reason why this night would be different. As twilight descended on December 18th, Harrison stood in his foxhole alongside Private Robert Chen, a 20-year-old from San Francisco, whose family had faced their own battles with prejudice during the war. Chen's parents, immigrants from China, had built a small grocery store in the city, working 18-hour days to provide for their family. When Chen had enlisted, his father had spoken to him about dignity, about proving oneself through actions rather than words, about standing firm in the face of those who questioned your worth. These lessons echoed Harrison's own experiences, creating an unspoken bond between two young men who understood what it meant to fight for a country that questioned their belonging. Chen had been assigned as Harrison's position partner 3 days earlier, and despite initial awkwardness, a mutual respect had developed between them. Both men understood the weight of representing entire communities in the eyes of those who judged based on appearance rather than character. They knew that any failure would be attributed not to individual shortcoming, but to presumed inadequacy of their entire race. Conversely, they also understood that excellence would too often be dismissed as exception rather than capability. Chen asked quietly as they watched the tree line, his breath visible in the freezing air, "Have you ever fired that weapon in combat? I mean, beyond the training ranges?" Harrison replied honestly, adjusting his position slightly to maintain circulation in the intense cold. "Not yet. I trained with it extensively back in Georgia, put thousands of rounds through it on the range. The instructors were surprised how accurate you could be with it once you understood its characteristics. The slow rate of fire means you can actually aim between shots, keep the weapon on target. Most people try to fight it, try to make it perform like those faster-firing weapons. But if you work with what it is rather than wishing it was something else, it becomes very effective. Still, you are right to ask. Training is not the same as the real thing. This will be the first time it truly matters." The grease gun's simplicity was both its greatest strength and its most mocked characteristic. Unlike more complex weapons, It featured only 4 moving parts in its firing mechanism. The bolt, weighing nearly a pound, operated on a simple blowback principle, requiring no complex gas systems or intricate timing mechanisms. The magazine held 30 rounds of .45 caliber ammunition, the same cartridge used in the beloved Colt 1911 pistol, providing stopping power that was undeniable at close range. The weapon's slow rate of fire, often criticized by those who preferred the rapid buzz of faster-firing designs, actually made it remarkably controllable in sustained bursts. While other submachine guns climbed off target during sustained fire, the grease gun stayed steady, allowing aimed shots rather than spray-and-pray tactics. As full darkness settled over the Ardennes, the temperature continued to drop. Harrison and Chen took turns on watch, 2 hours on, 2 hours attempting to sleep in the frozen earth of their position. The foxhole offered minimal protection from the elements, barely deep enough to provide cover from direct fire. Around them, 15 other soldiers maintained similar vigils, spread across the defensive line in positions separated by intervals of roughly 150 to 200 meters. The spacing was dangerously wide, a consequence of insufficient forces trying to hold too much ground, but it was the reality they faced. The American forces in this sector had been stretched thin by the demands of offensive operations elsewhere, leaving defensive positions undermanned and vulnerable. At 2200 hours, Sergeant McCreary made his rounds, moving quietly from position to position, checking on his men. His breath created clouds in the frigid air as he navigated between foxholes, careful to stay low and avoid silhouetting himself against the snow. When he reached Harrison and Chen, he crouched beside their foxhole and spoke in a low voice, his experienced eyes scanning the forest beyond their position. "Intelligence reports suggest possible enemy activity tonight," McCreary informed them, his tone serious but calm. "The pattern of their movements over the past week indicates they may try something under cover of darkness. Stay alert, trust your instincts, and remember your training. If something happens, do not hesitate. The enemy we face is experienced and dangerous. They know this terrain, they have operated in winter conditions before, and they will not make obvious mistakes. But you are prepared for this. I have watched both of you, and I know you will do what needs to be done." Harrison acknowledged the warning with a nod, his hands resting comfortably on the grease gun. The weapon's simplicity meant there was little that could go wrong mechanically, no safety to forget, no complex selector switch to fumble with in darkness. Pull the bolt back, release it to chamber around, squeeze the trigger. The straightforward nature of the design suddenly seemed less like a limitation and more like an advantage. In darkness, in cold, with adrenaline coursing through your system, simplicity could mean the difference between effective action and fatal hesitation. Chen asked McCreary before the sergeant moved on, "How far out do you think they might approach before we detect them?" McCreary considered the question carefully before responding. In this terrain, with the snow muffling sound and the darkness providing concealment, they could get within 75 to 100 meters before we hear them if they are skilled and careful. That is why your alertness matters so much tonight. The first indication might be very subtle, a sound that does not quite fit the normal pattern of wind and forest. Trust what you hear, even if you cannot see anything yet. Across the frozen expanse of forest, Lieutenant Weber's unit began their approach at 2300 hours. Moving in 3 groups of 15 to 16 soldiers each, they advanced with the confidence of veterans who had executed similar operations dozens of times. Weber had briefed his soldiers carefully, emphasizing silence, spacing, and mutual support. Each man knew his role, understood the plan, and moved with the assurance that came from training and experience. The snow-covered ground muffled their footsteps. The wind in the trees masked the small sounds of their movement. Weber's plan called for the 3 groups to approach different sections of the American line simultaneously, creating confusion and dividing the defenders' attention. What Weber did not account for, what his training and experience had not prepared him for, was the unique acoustic signature of the grease gun in night combat. The weapon's slow, deliberate rate of fire, 450 rounds per minute compared to the 550 of the MP40 or the 1200 of some other designs, created a distinctive sound pattern that was difficult to locate in the darkness. More importantly, The heavy bolt and simple blowback action produced minimal muzzle flash, a critical advantage in darkness, where bright weapon discharges revealed positions and destroyed night vision. The .45 caliber ammunition, being subsonic, did not produce the supersonic crack that higher velocity rounds created, further reducing the acoustic signature. At 23:30 hours, Private Chen, whose watch it was, detected movement in the forest ahead. The sound was almost imperceptible, a subtle disturbance in the natural rhythm of wind and snow. A branch moving in a pattern inconsistent with the wind direction, the faint crunch of snow under careful feet. He touched Harrison's shoulder, bringing him instantly alert, and pointed toward the suspected area. Both men strained their eyes against the darkness, waiting, listening, their hearts beginning to beat faster as adrenaline entered their systems. Harrison whispered, barely audible even to Chen beside him. I heard it too. Multiple contacts, moving carefully but definitely there. They are good, staying low using the terrain, but they are there. The standing orders were clear. Do not fire unless the enemy position is certain. Do not reveal defensive positions unnecessarily, but do not allow the enemy to close within grenade range. Harrison made a decision that would cascade into the night's extraordinary events. Rather than immediately opening fire and potentially revealing his position based on uncertain targets, he decided to wait until he could identify multiple threats clearly, maximizing the effect of his initial engagement. This patience, this discipline to wait despite mounting tension, reflected the quality of his training and the steadiness of his character. The German forces, meanwhile, continued their approach with practiced confidence. Corporal Richter, leading one of the three groups, had closed to within 75 meters of the American line when he spotted the outline of a foxhole ahead. He signaled his team to halt, studying the position carefully, trying to determine if it was occupied or abandoned. The winter campaign had taught him that abandoned positions were common, that defenders sometimes withdrew to more defensible locations, leaving empty holes to deceive attackers. The distinctive shape of Harrison's helmet was barely visible above the rim of the fighting position, but in the darkness and at distance, Richter could not be certain. Richter thought to himself, carefully considering his options, one position, probably two soldiers at most if it is even occupied, armed with those ridiculous stamped metal toys the Americans seem to prefer. Even if they are there, my group of 16 soldiers will overwhelm them in seconds once we close the final distance. The key is to move quickly once we commit, give them no time to react or call for support. He signaled his men forward, maintaining silence, confident in their numerical advantage and superior equipment. At 40 meters distance, Harrison made his decision. The lead elements of the German force had revealed themselves clearly enough through movement against the snow. Multiple figures advancing in tactical formation, weapons visible, intent unmistakable. He brought the grease gun to his shoulder, the weapon's wire stock extending to provide stability, and aligned the simple fixed sights on his first target. The grease gun's crude appearance belied its effectiveness at close range. .45 caliber ammunition, each round weighing approximately 15 grams moving at subsonic velocity, produced devastating results on impact while generating relatively little noise compared to higher velocity rounds. Harrison's factory experience had taught him to think mechanically, to understand tools as systems of interacting parts. The grease gun was a simple system. Heavy bolt travels forward, strips round from magazine, chambers it. Firing pin strikes primer. Powder ignites. Bullet exits barrel. Recoil drives bolt backward against spring pressure. Bolt extracts empty case, ejects it, returns forward to chamber next round. No gas system to tune, no complex lockup to time correctly. Just mass, spring pressure, and momentum. Simple physics operating in a predictable cycle. Harrison squeezed the trigger, releasing a controlled burst of 4 rounds. The grease gun's slow cyclic rate meant those 4 shots took approximately half a second, a deliberate aimed sequence rather than a wild spray. Each round traveled downrange at approximately 280 meters per second, subsonic and relatively quiet. The heavy .45 caliber projectiles found their target, and the lead German soldier went down without a sound, his body collapsing into the snow. Before his companions could react, Harrison shifted his aim slightly and fired again, another controlled burst that produced immediate results. The muzzle flash from the grease gun was remarkably minimal, a brief orange flicker that disappeared almost instantly. This was a function of the subsonic ammunition and the weapon's simple barrel design. No flash suppressor, no complex muzzle device, just a basic barrel that allowed gases to expand gradually rather than violently. The sound, while certainly audible, lacked the sharp crack of high-velocity weapons, instead producing a deeper, more muffled report that was difficult to locate precisely in the forest environment. These characteristics, born from the weapon's simple design and subsonic ammunition, gave Harrison a crucial advantage in the darkness. Corporal Richter, suddenly realizing his force was under effective fire from an unseen position, made a fatal error based on his assumptions. He assumed, based on the slow rate of fire and muffled sound, that he faced a single soldier with limited ammunition who would soon be forced to reload or who might panic under pressure. He ordered his men to rush the position, confident that overwhelming it quickly would end the resistance before the American could get help. This was standard doctrine: rush through ambush, close with the enemy before they can maintain effective fire. It had worked before. In Russia, in France. Richter had no reason to think it would fail now. What Richter failed to understand was the grease gun's magazine capacity and reload characteristics. 30 rounds provided substantial firepower, more than enough to engage multiple targets before requiring a magazine change. Moreover, the simple magazine design, a double-stack single-feed configuration, allowed for rapid changes when necessary. The magazine well was wide and forgiving, accepting magazines even in darkness or under stress. Most importantly, Harrison's training had emphasized magazine management, keeping track of rounds expended, knowing when to reload before the weapon ran dry. As the German soldiers rushed forward, their silhouettes visible against the snow, Harrison remained calm, his factory experience translating into steady hands and mechanical precision. He fired burst after burst, each grouping carefully aimed at center mass targets. The grease gun's heavy bolt cycling back and forth absorbed much of the recoil, keeping the weapon steady and on target. Unlike lighter, faster-firing weapons that climbed during sustained fire, the grease gun stayed flat, allowing Harrison to maintain aim throughout each burst. Chen, meanwhile, had begun firing his M1 Garand rifle at targets on the flanks, the distinctive 8-round clip providing supporting fire. The Garand's sharper report and brighter muzzle flash created additional confusion among the attacking German soldiers, making it difficult for them to assess exactly how many defenders they faced or where fire was originating. The combination of Harrison's controlled bursts and Chen's semi-automatic fire created the impression of a more heavily defended position than actually existed. Sergeant McCreary, alerted by the sound of engagement even at his distant position, began moving additional soldiers toward Harrison's location, but the distance between foxholes and the need for caution in movement meant reinforcement would take precious minutes. Harrison would have to hold alone, supported only by Chen, until help arrived. The weight of this responsibility settled on him, but rather than inducing panic, it focused his mind. Everything reduced to simple mechanics: identify target, align sights, controlled burst, shift to next target. The training took over, the repetition of thousands of practice rounds on the range translating into smooth, efficient action. The next 3 minutes would become the subject of after-action reports and tactical studies that continued for decades afterward. Harrison, operating with a weapon that had been mocked as worthless, demonstrated what focused training, calm determination, and appropriate technology could achieve. The grease gun's simplicity meant there were no complex malfunctions to interrupt his fire, no gas system to foul, no complex bolt lockup to fail, no intricate trigger mechanism to freeze in the cold, just a heavy bolt moving back and forth, powered by recoil and spring pressure. The slow cyclic rate allowed him to maintain aim between shots, transitioning smoothly from target to target. The .45 caliber ammunition proved devastatingly effective at close range, each hit stopping threats immediately. Corporal Richter went down approximately 90 seconds into the engagement. His assumption about facing a poorly equipped opponent proven tragically wrong. The American soldier he had dismissed, armed with a weapon he had mocked, had demonstrated superior fire discipline and marksmanship. Of the 16 soldiers in his group, 11 had been stopped in their advance before they could close within grenade range. The survivors, shocked and disoriented by the unexpected effectiveness of the defense, fell back into the forest, their confidence shattered by encountering resistance far more capable than anticipated. But the night's engagement was far from over. Lieutenant Weber, hearing the fighting to his left, recognized that his plan was unraveling. The assault on what should have been a lightly defended position had bogged down, the sound of sustained fire indicating serious resistance. He redirected his own group of 15 soldiers toward Harrison's position, determined to overwhelm it through sheer numbers. At the same time, the third German group, 16 soldiers strong, was approaching from a different angle, threatening to catch the American defenders in a crossfire. Weber's tactical training told him that concentration of force at the decisive point would overcome resistance, that numerical superiority properly applied was almost impossible to defeat. Harrison, having exhausted his first magazine after approximately 65 rounds across multiple bursts, executed a reload with practiced efficiency. His hands moved automatically, muscle memory from countless repetitions on the training range. Release magazine, it drops free. Reach to ammunition pouch, extract fresh magazine by feel. Guide it into magazine well, the wide opening accepting it smoothly even in darkness. Slap bottom to ensure seating. Ready to fire. 3 seconds from last shot to first shot of new magazine. This rapid reload capability, another benefit of the weapon's simple design, proved crucial as Weber's group emerged from the tree line. Chen called out, his voice tight with tension but controlled. More contacts, right side, 15 to 20 strong, moving in formation. They know where we are now. They are coming straight at us. Harrison shifted position slightly, bringing his weapon to bear on the new threat. His hands were steady despite the adrenaline, his breathing controlled despite the physical exertion and stress. The training had prepared him for this, had taught him that panic was a choice, that you could acknowledge fear and still function effectively. He had fired perhaps 70 rounds, had 5 full magazines remaining, approximately 140 rounds, plenty of ammunition if he maintained fire discipline, if he avoided panic fire, if he remembered his training. Lieutenant Weber, advancing at the head of his soldiers, suddenly realized he had made a catastrophic miscalculation. The American position he was attacking was not weakly defended or poorly equipped. The soldier firing that mocked grease gun was demonstrating a level of marksmanship and fire discipline that was decimating his force with disturbing efficiency. Weber's training had emphasized the importance of adapting to changing circumstances, but the speed and violence of Harrison's defense left little time for adjustment. Weber tried to organize a flanking movement to split his force and attack from multiple directions simultaneously, but the darkness, the terrain, and Harrison's effective fire made coordinated action nearly impossible. By this point, Sergeant McCreary had reached a position approximately 50 meters behind Harrison, bringing 2 additional soldiers with him. They added their fire to the engagement, their weapons providing supporting fire that helped suppress the German advance. But it was clear to McCreary, even in the confusion of night combat, that Harrison was the anchor of the defense. His position, his weapon, and his skill had disrupted the entire German attack plan, had turned what should have been an overwhelming assault into a costly engagement where the attackers struggled to maintain momentum. The third German group, approaching from yet another angle, found themselves under fire, not just from Harrison, but from the reinforcements McCreary had brought. The Americans, despite being outnumbered nearly 3-1 overall, had the advantage of prepared positions, familiarity with the terrain, and in Harrison's case, a weapon perfectly suited to the engagement conditions. The defensive advantage, often quantified by military theorists as requiring 3-1 odds in favor of attackers, was proving its worth. The grease gun's 45 caliber ammunition, moving at approximately 280 meters per second, was subsonic, meaning it did not produce the supersonic crack that higher velocity rounds created when they broke the sound barrier. This acoustic characteristic, combined with the weapon's low muzzle flash, made it extremely difficult for the German forces to pinpoint Harrison's exact location. They could hear fire. They could see the general area where shots originated, but the precise position remained elusive in the darkness and confusion. Return fire, when it came, was poorly aimed, the German soldiers shooting at sound and movement rather than clearly identified targets. Private Chen, fighting alongside Harrison, would later describe the experience in a letter to his family, written 3 weeks after the engagement. He wrote, "I have never seen anyone remain so calm under such pressure. While explosions and gunfire erupted all around us, Harrison fired with the precision of someone on a training range. Each burst was controlled, measured exactly what was needed and no more. Each reload executed smoothly. No fumbling, no hesitation. The weapon they had all mocked, that crude stamped metal tool that looked like something from a mechanic's workshop rather than a battlefield, became in his hands an instrument of survival. I understood that night that tools are neutral, that effectiveness comes from the person wielding them, not from their appearance or cost." At 00:15 hours, approximately 45 minutes after the engagement began, the surviving German soldiers began a general withdrawal. The attack had failed catastrophically. The supposedly weak American position had held against repeated assaults, and casualties had mounted to unsustainable levels. Lieutenant Weber, wounded but alive, led the retreat. His assumptions about American equipment and capability shattered as thoroughly as his tactical plan. Of the 47 soldiers who had started the infiltration operation with such confidence, fewer than half remained combat effective. The rest were casualties, stopped in their advance by a defense far more capable than anticipated. Harrison, his grease gun barrel hot from sustained firing, watched the forest return to silence. The sudden cessation of combat was almost disorienting after the intensity of the past 45 minutes. He had fired 5 magazines, approximately 140 rounds, in controlled bursts spread over the engagement. Each burst had been aimed, disciplined, exactly what the situation required. The weapon, despite its crude appearance and budget construction, had functioned flawlessly throughout. No jams, no malfunctions, no failures of any kind. The simplicity that invited mockery had proven to be profound reliability. Sergeant McCreary approached Harrison's position once it became clear the engagement had ended, moving carefully in case of remaining enemy soldiers. He looked at the young private, then at the grease gun, then back at Harrison's face. The weapon was still warm, snow melting into steam where it contacted the barrel. Empty magazines lay scattered around the foxhole, evidence of the sustained engagement. Chen sat beside Harrison, reloading his Garand, his hands shaking slightly now that the adrenaline was beginning to fade. McCreary said, his voice filled with respect and something approaching awe, "I have served in 3 major campaigns and fought alongside hundreds of soldiers from different units and backgrounds. What you did tonight, with a weapon most people consider inferior, was the finest defensive action I have ever witnessed. You held this position against odds that should have been overwhelming, and you did it with discipline and skill that would credit any soldier regardless of experience. This will go into the official record, and I will personally ensure that your actions receive proper recognition." Harrison replied quietly, his voice steady, despite the exhaustion beginning to set in. "The weapon is only as effective as the person using it, and I had good training. The Detroit factories where I worked taught me the value of simple, reliable design. This grease gun is not elegant, it is not expensive, it does not look impressive. But it does what it is supposed to do without failing. And sometimes that is more important than any amount of sophistication. I'm glad it worked, glad we held, glad Chen and I are both still here to talk about it." As dawn broke over the Ardennes on December 19th, the reality of the previous night's engagement became clear in the growing light. Intelligence personnel, examining the area where the German force had approached, found evidence of a substantial and well-planned infiltration attempt. The tracks in the snow told the story of 3 separate groups advancing with tactical spacing, the kind of operation that required training and experience to execute. The defensive success at Harrison's position had prevented what could have been a catastrophic breach of the American lines, potentially allowing enemy forces into rear areas where they could have disrupted supply lines and communications. Word of the engagement spread through the division with remarkable speed, carried by soldiers who had heard the fighting or participated in the defense. The official after-action report, filed by the company commander after interviewing participants and examining the site, noted that Private James Harrison, armed with an M3 submachine gun, had been directly responsible for stopping a reinforced enemy platoon's infiltration attempt, demonstrating exceptional marksmanship, fire discipline, and tactical judgment under extreme pressure. The report recommended Harrison for decoration, though the full recognition would take time to process through military bureaucracy. But the story's impact extended far beyond a single after-action report or potential medal. In the German units that had participated in the failed infiltration, survivors carried back accounts that fundamentally challenged their assumptions about American equipment, training, and capability. The crude weapon they had mocked had proven devastatingly effective in the hands of a skilled operator. The industrial philosophy of simplicity and reliability had defeated the craftsmanship approach of complex, expensive weapons. Most profoundly, the engagement had demonstrated that assumptions based on appearance rather than capability could be fatal. Corporal Hans Richter, one of the few from his group to survive the engagement, spent time in a field hospital recovering from his wounds. He spoke with other soldiers about the experience, his voice carrying a new respect that would have seemed impossible hours before. The mockery was gone, replaced by hard-won understanding. Richter said to a fellow patient, "We laughed at their weapons, called them toys and crude tools. We believed our superior equipment guaranteed victory, that our training and experience made us invincible. But that American soldier, the one we mocked before the attack, he taught us that the weapon matters far less than the warrior who wields it. He was calm when we expected panic, disciplined when we anticipated chaos, effective when we assumed incompetence. Our assumptions nearly cost me my life." The M3 submachine gun, the grease gun that had been dismissed and ridiculed since its introduction, began to gain a different reputation among soldiers who heard about Harrison's engagement. Those who had previously viewed it with contempt started requesting it for close quarters and defensive operations. The same characteristics that invited mockery began to be recognized as advantages in specific tactical situations. The slow rate of fire that seemed inadequate was actually controllable, allowing aimed shots. The crude construction that appeared inferior was actually reliable, functioning in conditions that stopped more complex weapons. The minimal muzzle flash that seemed unimportant was actually crucial for night fighting. The subsonic ammunition that lacked impressive velocity was actually quiet, preserving night vision and making positions hard to locate. Harrison himself remained characteristically humble about the engagement, deflecting praise and emphasizing the training he had received rather than any personal heroism. When interviewed by a Stars and Stripes correspondent several weeks later, he emphasized the lessons rather than the glory. He stated, "I was taught to maintain my equipment, to practice my marksmanship until it became automatic, to stay calm under pressure and trust my training." The grease gun is a well-designed tool for a specific job. It is not meant to be beautiful or impressive or expensive. It is meant to work when everything else is falling apart, when conditions are terrible and stress is high. That night in the Ardennes, it did exactly what it was designed to do, and I am grateful for that reliability. The broader implications of that December night extended into tactical doctrine and equipment philosophy across multiple nations' military establishments. Military analysts studying the engagement noted several crucial lessons that would influence thinking for years afterward. First, that weapon effectiveness depended heavily on the skill of the operator and the appropriateness of the tool to the specific tactical situation. A simple weapon in trained hands could outperform a complex weapon in untrained hands. Second, that industrial mass production and simplicity could produce results equal or superior to traditional craftsmanship in certain applications. The grease gun's $20 production cost had delivered performance matching or exceeding weapons costing 10 times as much. Third, that assumptions based on appearance or cost were dangerously misleading measures of actual capability. What looked crude might be perfectly adequate. What seemed expensive might be unnecessarily complex. The guide lamp division of General Motors, which manufactured the M3 submachine gun in Anderson, Indiana, would eventually produce approximately 600,000 units during the war and its immediate aftermath. The weapon's cost-effectiveness, approximately one-tenth the price of its predecessor, while providing similar or better performance in many situations, represented American industrial philosophy at its most pragmatic. The same approach that had made automobiles affordable to average Americans, the same mass production techniques that Henry Ford had pioneered, were being applied to military equipment with remarkable results. The grease gun embodied this philosophy perfectly. Simple design, stamped parts, minimal machining, rapid production, maximum reliability. For Private James Harrison, the recognition that followed the engagement brought both satisfaction and continued challenges. As an African-American soldier serving in an era when military segregation was official policy and racial prejudice remained deeply embedded in both military and civilian culture, his exceptional performance highlighted uncomfortable contradictions that the nation was not yet ready to fully address. He had proven himself equal or superior to any soldier regardless of race, demonstrating courage, skill, and dedication that should have been celebrated without qualification. Yet institutional prejudice remained, systemic barriers persisted, and recognition came slower and less completely than it should have. Sergeant McCreary, who had witnessed Harrison's performance firsthand and understood its significance, became an advocate for integration and equal treatment within his sphere of influence. He wrote in his personal journal, which was later donated to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, "I watched a man prove his worth beyond any possible doubt, demonstrating courage, skill, and dedication that should be celebrated without qualification. Yet I know he will return to a society that questions his equality, that maintains barriers based on nothing more substantial than prejudice and tradition." The contradiction is profound and shameful. We ask these men to fight for democracy while denying them its full benefits. We demand their sacrifice while questioning their capability. The hypocrisy becomes impossible to ignore once you have seen excellence in action. The grease gun itself underwent several modifications based on combat experience gathered from engagements like Harrison's defensive action. The M3A1 variant, introduced in December 1944, just days after the Ardennes engagement, incorporated improvements, including a fixed firing pin machined into the bolt face, elimination of the cocking lever in favor of a simpler finger recess on the bolt itself, and a redesigned stock plate with provisions for disassembly tools. These changes reduced the parts count even further, making the weapon even simpler and more reliable while actually reducing production time and cost. Harrison's combat success on December 18th helped validate the basic design philosophy that led to these refinements. As the war in Europe moved toward its conclusion in the spring of 1945, the lessons of that night in the Ardennes were being absorbed into tactical training throughout the American armed forces. Infantry schools began emphasizing that weapon selection should match mission requirements rather than prestige or appearance. The grease gun, once mocked, became a preferred choice for vehicle crews who needed compact, reliable weapons, for paratroopers who valued lightweight and simplicity, and for soldiers engaged in close-quarters urban fighting where controllability mattered more than rate of fire. The German armed forces, meanwhile, were learning their own lessons from encounters like the one Harrison had participated in. Their faith in superior engineering and traditional manufacturing methods was being challenged by the sheer industrial capacity and pragmatic design philosophy of their opponents. The Americans were not trying to make perfect weapons. They were making adequate weapons in overwhelming quantities, a strategic approach that proved devastatingly effective. When one American weapon failed or was lost, 3 more were available to replace it. When one soldier fell, 2 more arrived with fresh equipment. The mathematics of industrial production were overwhelming the craftsmanship approach. Lieutenant Friedrich Weber, recovering from his wounds at a hospital in Germany, had time to reflect on the failed infiltration and what it revealed about the changing nature of warfare. He wrote in a letter to a fellow officer who was still at the front, "We were taught to value precision, craftsmanship, the superiority of our equipment and training. But I led 47 well-equipped soldiers against prepared positions and suffered catastrophic losses, in large part because one American soldier with a weapon we dismissed as worthless demonstrated superior tactical judgment and marksmanship. Our assumptions were our greatest vulnerability. We believed appearance indicated capability, that cost reflected effectiveness, that our traditional methods guaranteed success. All of these beliefs were proven wrong in the span of 45 minutes. The letter continued, describing Weber's growing understanding of how industrial capacity was reshaping warfare. He wrote, "I have learned that modern war is not won by individual craftsmanship or superior skill alone, though these remain important. It is won by the nation that can produce adequate equipment in overwhelming quantities, that can replace losses faster than they accumulate, that can arm every soldier with reliable tools, even if those tools lack elegance. The Americans have understood this in ways we did not. Their weapons may lack the precision of ours, but they function reliably and exist in numbers we cannot match. When I return to duty, if I return to duty, I will never again dismiss an opponent based on the appearance of their equipment." After the war ended in May 1945, the grease gun continued to serve in American military inventory for decades. Its simplicity and reliability made it popular for vehicle crews who needed weapons that could withstand the vibration and contamination of armored vehicles. Tank crews, truck drivers, and artillery teams preferred it over more complex weapons that required more maintenance and were more prone to malfunction. The weapon Harrison had carried that December night would see service in Korea, Vietnam, and numerous other conflicts well into the 1990s, outlasting many more sophisticated designs. Harrison himself returned to Detroit after the war, resuming work in the automotive industry. He rarely spoke publicly about his wartime experiences, preferring to let his actions speak for themselves rather than seeking recognition or attention. When the local newspaper ran a feature article about area veterans in 1953, Harrison's only comment about the December engagement was characteristically modest. He said simply, "I did what needed to be done with the tools I was given. Any well-trained soldier would have done the same. The weapon worked as designed, the training proved effective, and I was fortunate enough to survive." That is all there is to say about it. But Sergeant William McCreary, who remained in contact with Harrison for many years after the war, told a different story when interviewed for an oral history project in 1978. McCreary stated, sitting in his Pennsylvania home surrounded by memorabilia from his military service, what James Harrison accomplished that night went far beyond tactical success or individual heroism. He challenged assumptions that were deeply embedded in military culture and civilian society alike. He proved that character and skill mattered more than prejudice or appearances, that simple tools properly employed could defeat complex systems, and that American industrial philosophy could produce weapons as effective as any in the world. He was an exceptional soldier who deserved recognition he never fully received, not because he lacked merit, but because society was not ready to acknowledge it. McCreary's voice grew emotional as he continued, "I served with hundreds of men over my military career, from North Africa through Europe, from privates to generals. James Harrison stands out in my memory, not just for his tactical performance that night, though that alone was extraordinary, but for his dignity in the face of constant prejudice, his professionalism despite being questioned and doubted, his willingness to serve a country that did not fully respect his humanity. He proved himself by every measure that should matter, yet the recognition came slowly and incompletely. It is one of the great shames of our system that men like him had to prove themselves at all." The M3 submachine gun, the grease gun, eventually became a collector's item and a symbol of American pragmatism in military equipment design. Military historians point to it as an example of successful design philosophy, where simplicity, reliability, and cost-effectiveness were prioritized over aesthetic appeal or traditional manufacturing approaches. The weapon that German soldiers mocked as a toy had proven itself through the most demanding test imaginable: combat effectiveness when lives depended on performance. Museums today display it alongside more famous weapons of the Second World War, and informed curators tell the stories of soldiers like Harrison, who proved that effectiveness transcends appearance. In the years following the war, several of the German soldiers, who had participated in the December 18th infiltration, were interviewed about their experiences for various historical projects and documentaries. Their accounts consistently emphasized the shock of encountering effective resistance from a weapon and a soldier they had assumed were inferior. One former soldier, speaking in a 1962 documentary about the Ardennes campaign, stated with obvious emotion, "We were taught from childhood that our equipment was superior, that American mass production meant low quality and poor performance. The reality was far different. That night in the Ardennes, we learned that assumptions based on appearance or national origin could be fatal. The American soldier we faced was better trained, better disciplined, and more effective than our prejudices allowed us to believe. The weapon he carried, which we had mocked hours before, proved devastatingly capable in his skilled hands." Another veteran, interviewed for a 1985 oral history project, reflected on how the encounter had changed his understanding of warfare and capability. He said, "I was 19 years old, convinced of my superiority, certain that our victory was inevitable because our weapons were better made and our soldiers better trained. That night shattered every assumption I held. I watched soldiers I had served with for months fall to fire from a weapon we had all dismissed as worthless. I realized that what mattered was not the cost of equipment or the nation of origin, but the skill of the person wielding it and whether the tool was appropriate to its task. It was a hard lesson learned at terrible cost. The tactical lessons from Harrison's defensive action were incorporated into military doctrine across multiple nations as detailed studies of World War II engagements were conducted in subsequent decades. The engagement demonstrated several crucial principles that became standard teaching points in infantry schools worldwide. First, the importance of fire discipline and aimed shots over volume of fire. Harrison had fired approximately 140 rounds over 45 minutes, each burst carefully aimed, while his attackers had expended far more ammunition with far less effect. Second, the advantages of weapons with minimal muzzle flash in night combat operations. The grease gun's characteristics had made Harrison's position difficult to locate, complicating enemy response. Third, the value of reliability over complexity in stressful situations. The weapon had functioned flawlessly throughout sustained engagement, requiring no field maintenance or adjustment. Fourth, the critical role of thorough training in maximizing equipment effectiveness. Harrison's factory experience and military training had combined to create exceptional performance. For the American Armed Forces, the engagement also highlighted uncomfortable truths about racial integration and equality that could no longer be easily dismissed or ignored. Harrison's performance had been exceptional by any measure, demonstrating conclusively that African American soldiers were fully capable of matching or exceeding the performance of any soldiers regardless of race. Yet institutional segregation remained in place for several more years after the war ended, not being fully dismantled until President Truman's executive order in 1948 mandating equality of treatment and opportunity in the armed forces. The contradiction between stated democratic values and actual practice became increasingly difficult to justify when soldiers like Harrison were proving themselves equal to any in combat effectiveness and dedication. Private Robert Chen, who had fought alongside Harrison that night and shared his foxhole during those intense 45 minutes, later became a physician in San Francisco, serving his community for 4 decades before retiring. In a 1995 interview conducted for a project documenting Asian American military service, Chen reflected on the experience and its broader significance with the perspective of 50 years. He said, his voice still carrying emotion after all that time, "James Harrison taught me lessons that night that went far beyond military tactics or combat skills. He showed me that dignity comes from within, from knowing your worth regardless of others' prejudices and assumptions." He faced mockery for his weapon and prejudice for his race, yet he remained focused on his duty and performed with exceptional skill and courage. He never sought recognition or praise, never complained about the unfairness of having to prove himself while others were assumed competent until proven otherwise. He simply did what needed to be done with professionalism and grace. Chen continued, his words carrying the weight of a lifetime of reflection. "That night changed fundamentally how I understood courage and character. I had grown up facing prejudice, experiencing discrimination, being told in subtle and not so subtle ways that I was not fully American despite being born in San Francisco. The military offered a chance to prove my loyalty and capability, but the same dynamics existed there as in civilian society. Watching Harrison under fire, seeing his calm professionalism, his absolute mastery of his equipment and task, I understood that excellence was the only answer to prejudice, that action spoke louder than any words could, and that maintaining dignity in the face of disrespect required strength beyond physical courage. The Guide Lamp Division factory in Anderson, Indiana, where Harrison's grease gun had been manufactured, alongside hundreds of thousands of others, was recognized after the war for its contribution to the Allied victory. The factory had employed thousands of workers, many of them women who had entered the industrial workforce for the first time during the war emergency. These workers, using stamping presses and simple assembly techniques, had produced weapons that proved as effective as any made through traditional methods. The same industrial philosophy that had made automobiles affordable to average American families, that had transformed the nation from agricultural to industrial economy over previous decades, had been applied to weapons production with remarkable success. The transition of the Guide Lamp factory from automotive parts to weapons production and back to civilian goods after the war demonstrated American industrial flexibility and the contribution of civilian manufacturing expertise to military capability. The workers who had assembled grease guns during the war years carried that experience back into peacetime production, applying lessons learned about quality control, efficiency, and reliability to automotive manufacturing. The cross-pollination of military and civilian industrial practices strengthened both sectors. Harrison's grease gun, the specific weapon he carried on December 18, 1944, was not preserved for historical purposes, despite its role in a tactically significant engagement. Like most military equipment, it was reconditioned after the war, had its serial numbers recorded in depot inventories, and was reissued to other soldiers or units as needed. It may have served in Korea, Vietnam, or other conflicts over subsequent decades. It may have been scrapped when finally worn beyond economical repair. Its physical fate is unknown, but the design it represented, the philosophy of simple reliability over complex elegance, continued to influence American military equipment development for generations. In military museums today across the United States and Europe, the M3 submachine gun is displayed alongside more famous weapons of the Second World War. The Thompson submachine gun, with its distinctive drum magazine and association with earlier conflicts. The M1 Garand rifle that General George Patton called the greatest battle implement ever devised. The Browning automatic rifle, with its sustained fire capability. Visitors who examine the grease gun often comment on its crude appearance, the stamped metal construction that seems almost primitive compared to the machined precision of other weapons. The utilitarian design lacks any aesthetic refinement, any concession to visual appeal. But knowledgeable curators, when asked about the weapon, tell stories of soldiers like James Harrison, who proved that effectiveness transcends appearance, that well-designed tools in skilled hands can achieve remarkable results, and that the measure of a weapon is not its beauty, but its reliability when lives depend on performance. They explain how the $20 production cost allowed manufacture in overwhelming quantities, how the simple design meant it could be produced by workers with minimal training, how the robust construction meant it functioned in conditions that stopped more delicate weapons. They contextualize it within American industrial philosophy and strategic thinking, showing how it represented a different approach to warfare than traditional methods. The night of December 18, 1944, became part of divisional history for the units involved, referenced in unit records and veteran reunions for decades afterward. Soldiers who had served in that sector of the Ardennes spoke of it as a turning point in how they viewed their equipment and their fellow servicemen. The mockery that had initially greeted the grease gun gave way to respect based on proven performance. Similarly, prejudices about African American soldiers' capabilities were challenged by undeniable evidence of exceptional performance, though changing deeply embedded attitudes proved to be a process measured in years and decades rather than moments. Lieutenant Friedrich Weber survived the war and returned to Munich, where he worked as an engineer in the rebuilding of Germany, applying his technical education to the massive reconstruction effort that occupied the nation for years. In a 1976 letter to an American military historian researching the Ardennes campaign for a comprehensive study, Weber wrote candidly about the December engagement and what it had meant to him personally. He stated, "I learned that night that confidence untempered by respect for your opponent leads to defeat. The American soldier I faced was better trained, better disciplined, and more effective than our assumptions allowed us to believe. We had convinced ourselves of our superiority based on nothing more substantial than propaganda and prejudice. It was a lesson learned at terrible cost, with soldiers under my command paying the price for my assumptions." Weber's letter continued with remarkable honesty about his own growth and understanding. He wrote, "In the years since the war ended, I've had much time to reflect on what we were taught, what we believed, and how wrong so many of those beliefs proved to be. We were told that certain people were inferior, that certain nations could not match our capabilities, that our methods and traditions guaranteed victory. Every one of these beliefs was proven false, often at great cost. That night in the Ardennes was one of many encounters that demonstrated the gap between what we assumed and what was actually true. I am grateful to have survived to learn these lessons, though I wish the education had not required such a high price. For James Harrison himself, recognition came slowly and incompletely, filtered through the barriers of prejudice and institutional inertia that characterized the post-war period. He received the Bronze Star for his actions on December 18th, a decoration that acknowledged valor and exceptional performance, but fell short of the highest recognitions that some historians later argued his actions merited. The citation praised his coolness under fire, his effective use of available weapons, and his contribution to the successful defense of critical positions. But the full story of his exceptional defensive action remained largely unknown outside military circles for many years, tucked away in after-action reports and unit histories that few civilians ever examined. It was not until the 1980s, when historians began conducting more comprehensive research into African-American contributions to the war effort as part of a broader movement to recover overlooked histories, that Harrison's story received broader attention. Researchers examining combat records from the Ardennes campaign found the after-action reports and began interviewing surviving witnesses. Sergeant McCreary's testimony was particularly valuable, providing detailed first-hand account of what he had witnessed that night. Chen's recollections added additional perspective, describing Harrison's demeanor and performance from the viewpoint of someone who had fought beside him. These interviews and archival research eventually led to several articles in military history journals, a segment in a documentary about African-American military service, and inclusion in exhibits at museums dedicated to World War II history. But for Harrison himself, by then in his 60s and 70s, the recognition came too late to materially affect his life or opportunities. He had built a successful career in the automotive industry through the same quiet competence he had demonstrated in military service, earning respect through consistent performance rather than acclaim or publicity. The grease gun's reputation underwent a complete transformation over the decades following the war, from being mocked as a crude substitute for proper weapons to being recognized as an innovative design that prioritized the characteristics that actually mattered in combat. Reliability trumped complexity, simplicity exceeded sophistication, affordability enabled abundance. The same industrial philosophy that had made Henry Ford's Model T accessible to millions of Americans, transforming transportation and society in the process, had been applied to military equipment, with profound results that extended far beyond individual weapons. Military procurement officers and designers, studying the lessons of World War II, recognized that the grease gun represented successful alignment of industrial capacity with tactical requirements. It was not the best submachine gun by many traditional measures. It was not the fastest firing, not the most accurate at range, not the most precisely manufactured. But it was reliable, simple, cheap to produce, and effective within its intended operational parameters. These characteristics made it more valuable strategically than weapons that scored higher on individual performance metrics, but cost more to produce or required more maintenance to keep functional. In 2003, the United States Army officially retired the last M3 submachine guns from its inventory, ending a service life of nearly 60 years that far exceeded the original design expectations. The announcement was accompanied by articles in military publications reflecting on the weapon's history and the soldiers who had carried it through conflicts spanning 6 decades. Several of these articles mentioned Harrison's December engagement as an example of the grease gun's effectiveness when properly employed by trained soldiers. The weapon had proven remarkably durable, with many examples remaining functional despite decades of service, a testament to the robust simplicity of the original design. Harrison passed away in 2006 at the age of 85, having lived to see attitudes about race, equality, and recognition gradually evolve over his lifetime. His obituary in the Detroit Free Press mentioned his wartime service and the Bronze Star he had earned, though the full details of his exceptional defensive action remained known primarily to military historians and fellow veterans who had studied or participated in the Ardennes campaign. He was survived by 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and a community that had known him as a quiet, dignified man who had served his country with honor and his community with dedication. Sergeant William McCreary, who had witnessed Harrison's performance that December night and had advocated tirelessly for proper recognition of his achievement, wrote a final tribute that was read at Harrison's funeral service by McCreary's daughter, as the sergeant himself had passed away several years earlier. The tribute stated, "James Harrison embodied the best qualities of the American soldier and the American citizen. He faced prejudice with dignity, mockery with competence, and mortal danger with courage that never wavered. He proved that character transcends circumstances, that skill defeats assumptions, and that simple tools wielded by exceptional individuals can achieve extraordinary results. He was my comrade in arms, and I was honored to serve alongside him. His example taught me that true worth is measured not by the recognition received, but by the integrity maintained and the duties fulfilled." The tribute continued, reflecting McCreary's own evolution and understanding. "I grew up in a society that taught me to accept prejudice as natural, to see segregation as proper, to question the capabilities of people who look different from myself. James Harrison and soldiers like him taught me how wrong those assumptions were, how much talent and capability I had been conditioned to dismiss or overlook. That night in the Ardennes, I watched excellence in action and understood that my previous assumptions had been not just wrong, but morally indefensible. I spent the rest of my life trying to learn from that lesson, trying to see people as individuals rather than categories, trying to judge based on character and capability rather than appearance or origin. The story of that December night, of a weapon mocked as worthless proving its value through the most demanding test imaginable, carries lessons that extend beyond military tactics or equipment design into fundamental questions about judgment, prejudice, and the nature of effectiveness. It speaks to the danger of assumptions based on appearance rather than evidence, the importance of recognizing merit, regardless of preconceptions, and the power of simple, well-executed solutions to complex problems. These lessons remain relevant long after the specific engagement faded into history, long after the participants passed from living memory into historical record. The grease gun that German soldiers laughed at, that seemed too crude to be effective, that appeared to be nothing more than a stamped metal toy assembled by factory workers rather than skilled craftsmen, had silenced their mockery through undeniable performance that could not be dismissed or explained away. In Harrison's hands, armed with thorough training from instructors who understood the weapon's characteristics, supported by the steady determination that came from knowing his worth regardless of others' opinions, it became exactly what its designers had intended: a reliable, effective tool that worked when everything else was falling apart, when conditions were terrible and stress was overwhelming, when the margin between survival and disaster came down to whether equipment functioned as designed. The transformation was complete and profound. What began as contempt ended in respect, earned through performance. What started as mockery concluded with recognition, however delayed and incomplete. The night of December 18, 1944, demonstrated that true effectiveness comes not from appearance or cost or traditional prestige or inherited assumptions, but from the combination of appropriate design meeting genuine requirements, thorough training that builds competence into instinct, and the character of those who put tools to use in service of something larger than themselves. Whether that service is defending a foxhole in a frozen forest or building a life of dignity and contribution despite obstacles that should never have existed. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.